Well, hey everyone, I am now talking with Bonnie Kristian. She is the author of this book that I have right here, Untrustworthy, The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. She's also a columnist for Christianity Today and The Week. I'm saying that right? I was like, is it this week or The Week?
You are saying it right, though. Actually, I left there in May, so not anymore.
Okay.
But I was for a very long time.
Yeah.
That was sort of like my home base.
I
Yeah.
was going to say, I was reading in your book that you had written for them for like 10 years or something, right?
Almost. Yeah. I think it came out to like just shy of 7 or 8. So yeah, quite a while. But haven't been there for a few months now.
Well, lots of writing in your career. And when I went to Twitter to say, like, who are women that can speak on the intersection of faith, politics, and civility, your name came up right away from quite a few people. And judging from the title of this book, that makes a lot of sense. And I've seen a lot of your work online just talking about the intersection of these things. So tell us just a little bit about yourself, I guess, and how did you get into writing about this stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So I knew from like quite young that I wanted to write for a living, and I would say by like high school, I had just like narrowed in on journalism, having come to accept that I was really bad at fiction. And so after college, I spent a few years in DC working at some political nonprofits where we knew each other then, right?
Yeah, I was trying to
Yeah,
remember,
like a
how
little
did we
bit.
meet at some point? I think, where did you work again?
You were at Heritage then, I believe,
Yeah.
and I was at Young Americans for Liberty at the
Okay.
time.
Yeah, that's probably
Yeah.
what it was. Yeah.
Um, and so, there was a lot of good about that, but I realized like if I wanted to write about ideas more than like come to our happy hour, which I did,
A lot of that in DC.
then there's a lot of that, yeah, that I would probably need another degree. And so we moved out to Minnesota for me to go to seminary. And it was while I was in seminary that I started like slowly building up a freelance, well, mostly freelance journalism portfolio. As we already discussed, I was mainly at the Week for a long time, but other places as well. And then I did my first book in 2018, good Lord. And then this book this year. And yeah, so it was at the Week, but also at Christianity Today and elsewhere that I started writing about the the themes that show up in Untrustworthy. And that wasn't really sort of a deliberate thing to begin with. It was sort of just driven by what was happening in the news. And gradually I started to sort of see them as a a connected thing, part of a bigger picture, bigger story, and something that I thought would be worthwhile to write about it in a format that people care about, hopefully for more than like 2 days, which is the
Right.
lifespan of a lot of things that I
Exactly.
write. So
Mhm.
yeah, here we are.
Okay, so one thing I've keep hitting on is that seems like so much has changed since 2016. I don't know if it was Donald Trump, but he seems to be part of it in terms of how we all navigate this space. I think for me, at least, I saw a great divide like I had never seen before on the right and within the Christian community. How have you seen that change and morph since then? And is it in a new place now, in a different place now than it has been before?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think one word that I've used about what's happened in since like roughly 2016 is that it's something of an apocalypse in the sense of like an unveiling. Like, and I think in many cases what we're seeing was already there to some degree, and not to say that like Trump or other important figures or developments didn't encourage it and help it along, but I think there was some sense in which it sort of these people in terms of event revealed what was already there, sort of maybe restrained by different like norms of what's polite and what's appropriate. And but it's not that it wasn't there underneath the whole time, if that makes sense. But I do think that the technological changes that we've had in the last 20, 30 years, especially in like the news media space, are a really big factor, and something that I talk a lot about in the book. Essentially just the amount of time and like mental energy and space that we spend on politics and on these very contentious issues has so enormously increased, even compared to a decade ago. Like in 2012, I don't remember if I had a smartphone yet. That might have been the year I got one, but even then it wasn't the way it is now, right? Where like any moment you have 2 seconds in the line at the grocery store, you have your phone out. And I think just that massive increase in the quantity of information, and like many of it, like some of it really contentious, a lot of it making major truth claims, that's coming at us all day long, every day. We don't know how to handle that. We don't, like, our brains are, like, physical brains are struggling to handle it. Like socially, we don't know how to handle it. Intellectually, we don't know how to handle it. And we're seeing the fruits of that, just like deep incapacity to deal with what's coming at us.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had those moments where, maybe I am in line at the grocery store and I open up Twitter or something, and like I'm all of a sudden irritated. I'm all of a sudden, feeling upset about something where I'm like, if I had just not opened it, I wouldn't even know about this particular tweet that's making me angry, that's going around. And so I totally agree with you on that. And I loved your point in the early part of your book when you were talking about the yard signs. You talk about the infamous yard sign that we've all seen about, I believe in this house, we believe that science is real, love is love, etc. And how that sort of brought like Twitter to the neighborhood. And that's not a great thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I find them really fascinating, and I still do. So when I first heard about that, we were living in the Twin Cities, in just a deep, deep blue neighborhood. And those yard signs were everywhere. You could hardly go down a block without having multiples of them. And so I was curious because, like, I don't know, like when I was 21, I had like some bumper stickers on my car, but when that car died, like it never occurred to me that I would keep that going, or like that I would put a political sign in my yard, especially not like outside of election season, right? Like this is just a permanent thing. And so I interviewed people in my neighborhood, like through Facebook and stuff, and was like, can you tell me about why you do this? And it was very much about like wanting to signal their identity and like show that they're good people. But it was also sort of intended in some cases as something like they didn't use this word, but like a warning, of like, we want to show what we don't like as much as what we do like. Like one woman told me, I asked a question about like, well, what if you had like friends or family or somebody who didn't agree with this, and they come to your house and they see this, like, how do you handle that? And her answer was like, well, I don't know that anybody would be welcome in my home who doesn't agree with this. And so I just found this super interesting and wrote about it. And then we moved to Pennsylvania, not this past summer, but the summer before, and it's much more purple. And so there's still a lot of yard signs, but they're more mixed, right? Like you have more politically conservative ones as well, or they're like Christian, but very clearly like using Christian symbolism, but clearly intending to communicate a political message. And so I haven't similarly interviewed people here, but it's interesting to see sort of that broader spectrum of that need to broadcast our politics in our physical spaces in a way that's honestly pretty confrontational. And especially thinking about it as someone moving to a new neighborhood, like on my particular block here, maybe there's one sign, if that, but like it would be more difficult, I think, to get to know my neighbors if like we were putting up these conflicting signs, and to go to them and try to like it's awkward if you're the person with in this house we believe sign, and your neighbor has some like clearly much further right-wing sign, and you got to like roll up with the plate of cookies, right? Like that's it just creates a barrier, I think, to sort of like normal functional real life community that I for all the like reporting I've done on it and thinking about it, I still don't really understand why people decide that is worth it to put up that barrier.
Yeah, I remember in election season, last election, 2020, my neighbor put up a massive Trump sign, like it wasn't a sign, it was a flag. And I was like, oh boy, like, because up until that point in my cul-de-sac, I really didn't know people's politics. And I was kind of happy about that. I didn't really want to know their politics. But then my other neighbors, kind of in response to that, they put up a big Black Lives Matter flag. And so all of a sudden,
like escalatory.
Our cul-de-sac felt really weird and awkward.
Yeah. You get into like an arms race, I think. And, once probably we would have felt that it was rude to start something like that, I think, if it wasn't sort of already like the local culture. But now, like, that's gone. And people just go for it. And like, it's hard to argue against to some degree, because people say like, well, doesn't it matter who's president, or like, don't you care about how Black people are being treated in America? It's like, yes, but perhaps something is also being lost by putting this out there.
Right, by leading with politics first, by having that be the lens through which you view all people, without the very layered and like nuanced concepts of all of our lives, which is true, that's the case. When it comes to civility, that almost seems like a lost art or an old term these days. How do you see that as intersecting with all of this?
I think it's a big part of it. I think it's something that in some cases is sort of just forgotten, or in a lot of cases at this point is and this is on left and right alike, is really just outright dismissed as something that's an impediment to whatever the bigger project is, right? Like, the idea that I don't know if civility is the favored word, but I've definitely read specific arguments from the left about like, this is just a way to gatekeep essentially who's allowed to speak, and to crowd out voices that maybe are a little bit unconventional, or maybe like speaking hard truths. And then from the right, the version of it is something like, this is just something that the elite care about, that they're using to silence the people, and they're so easily offended, they're snowflakes, so they want you to be civil, that sort of thing. And yeah, I think that's a difficult shift to reverse once it happens, because it is easier to sort of toss that out and say, we have these other things going on, we don't have time for that, or that's an impediment, or that's perpetuating injustice. But I think there was a good reson why that was something we cared about once, right? I mean, I know I don't have to sell you on that. But yeah, I think, I don't know, there are certainly examples in history of societies sort of moving back towards civility, or towards greater like interest in nuance and care for how we speak to one another. I don't know how you make that happen from scratch.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think having these conversations, I think we've got, a lot of the people we're interviewing for this event are some of those middle ground voices that are not afraid to say this is how it should be done, despite the pushback they're getting. And I think the more that we can elevate that kind of talk, the better. We know that the news, that politicians like always make the loudest racket, because like whatever makes the news, it's all this horrible cycle in terms of the news websites and TV stations, and how they get traffic, make money. You wrote about that. And then also just what outrages people. I mean, even having worked in political nonprofits and places like that, and sending out the emails, you've probably maybe seen some of that. When you're sending out emails and trying to get donations, trying to get email addresses and rile people up. I mean, it is really shameless sometimes what people are willing to put in there. And so we need more people on board with this. I liked in your intro, you had this sentence that I wrote down. She invited them to look away from their screens and out into the world, to remember the goodness in their lives, the ordinary hopes and joys never written into the cable news narrative. And I thought that was so beautiful, because we are so siloed into our phones and into the news and what is happening. And I don't know, I mean, do you think COVID made that worse?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we have just the sheer fact of like being home and having time to fill for like certainly like the more like white collar, like laptop class people, right? Like the people who are going to be spending a lot of time on this in many cases, but even for folks who are just like sitting and watching cable in their living room, like there was nowhere to go, right? Like in many places, like what else were you going to do? So I think that did exacerbate things. And then of course, once habits are set, it's hard to break them and to go back and sort of like, it's like the intellectual version of like trying to drag yourself back to exercising in the spring, right?
Right.
That's a hard thing to reverse. And so yeah, I think COVID was part of it, but I think we were also trending that way already. Like there is other data that I think I mentioned in the book that suggests that even as people's trust in media has declined, their consumption has gone up. And in some cases, that's going to be like, people saying, well, the stuff that I'm consuming is trustworthy, right? And it's the other stuff I don't trust. But in other cases, it is people like watching everything and reading things with sort of a general cynicism, but they still keep coming back for more.
You said it. You said the trust has gone down, but the consumption has gone up. And so how does that make sense?
Just like, yeah, it doesn't. But I mean, like you said, I think in some cases we'll rationalize about like, well, I'm picking the good stuff. But in a lot of cases, I think it's just, even if we know it's not great, it's appealing. And this is sort of like the audience version, or it's exciting, or it's enraging, or it, really hypes up our fears. And this is like the audience version of like what you were describing on the email side, where there's like, you maybe know it's not the best, right? But you have the data showing that it works. And that has like a very like knowledge of good and evil feel of like, I know this will get clicks, so I'm going to go with that. And then on the audience side, like, I know this isn't great for me, but I can't look away. And those just like feed into each other back and forth.
Yeah, I remember I got a job offer once. This was probably, years ago, probably 2017, maybe, I don't even remember. It was a long time ago, but it was politically based, and they were offering me like a lot of money. And I remember I was like, I can't do it. Like, I just can't do it. And so we've got to have a backbone. I think like people of character, like it matters to be able to say no to things that are wrong. I mean, that's basic, common human decency, but I think we lose that, and we've lost that in some ways. So I had a question that kind of just came to me before we popped on here. I know that you talk a lot about QAnon conspiracy theories in the book, which I actually don't know that much about myself, but I know that they're there and you're talking about them. And so I'm wondering, how do you deal civilly with people who really buy into the conspiracy theories, but they're also your fellow Christians and your fellow neighbors? Like, how do you balance that?
I mean, so the biggest recommendation that I came to sort of unwillingly, because it's very unsatisfying in a lot of ways, is basically just you can't argue with them about that stuff, like to the point of unless you're years deep into a relationship with someone, and like there's a already established like trust and respect for one another, and they come to you clearly like interested in discussing and like sincerely asking like, what do you think about this? Not let me prove this to you, or like let me show you why you're wrong. Unless there's that true willingness for conversation on both sides in that context of relationship, I think it's just a waste of everyone's time to try to talk about it. So I would say, for the most part, don't try to deal with it.
Yeah.
Because the way that things like QAnon and a lot of modern like conspiracy theorizing works is there's really not that much of a theory. It's not really about like setting out this elaborate proof and like getting classified government documents and carefully making the case piece by piece. Like, it's not the red string and the charts on the wall and stuff, right? It's just sort of like allegations and innuendo, and you can't argue with that. And frequently there will be just such a sheer volume of claims that anyone who has like a normal amount of like job and life commitments and like children to care for, you just can't. And even if you did go down and say like, all right, I'm going to one by one go down your list and like explain what's wrong with these claims, there's an endless font of more claims. And so the idea that you're going to argue someone out of that, like no matter how civil and careful you are, you're just not. And to go back to that line you quoted from the opening, I think far more worthwhile of your time is to be building the relationship in like other non-political, more normal ways, like talk about other things, do other things together, because for them and just as much for you, like any hour that you're spending just like having a normal meal together, like that's an hour that you're not spending going deep into internet rabbit holes, and that's a win for both of you.
Yeah. And I don't know what I'm trying to say with this, but just like if someone dies being a QAnon conspiracy theorist, like their life is no less valuable. whether or not you convince them they were wrong. And so like kind of looking at people as the whole picture, I think it reminds me of this podcast I listened to. Have you ever heard of Heavyweight?
Mm-mm.
Well, I highly recommend that to everyone. It's Gimlet Media. Anyway, they go into these stories of people that, you start to see them as one way in the beginning. And then by the end of the episode, it's like they've drawn a whole life picture of who this person is. Like, even if they are, say, maybe they are like a racist or something like that. But at the end of the day, like, you are able to see the whole of that person, their life, maybe why they came to be the way that they are. And just because someone's wrong doesn't necessarily mean, they're not worth being in a relationship with. And I think so many times that is discounted these days when it comes to these political issues kind of invading.
And I also think that in terms of like the people that we think of as like, oh, his brain is really broken by politics, or like, he's just really off the deep end. I read so many accounts from like people, especially people whose loved ones have really gotten into QAnon, but also, other varieties. And there's so frequently a theme of like loneliness being a part of it. Like that the reason some of this stuff is so appealing and the reason people go in as deep as they do is because they're finding like a community around it online and they're making friends. And so I think just like the simple act of being in that relationship with them, you're not pushing back on detail by detail, but you're providing that community outside of just that one, like often poisonous political space.
Definitely. The last thing I want to ask you about is the church. My book that's coming out, Reason to Return, is about the church and the positive aspects that it brings to our lives, specifically as women, but as people in general. And the church we've also seen division there, but I think there are also a lot of churches that we don't hear about that are still a really grounding, good space, a healthy space where we're meeting with people and we're not talking politics. I can say that from my perspective, at least my church, we don't do that, and we haven't had any problems with it. And I know that's not everyone's story. I hear that now.
The drilling in the bathroom. Yeah. Sorry about that.
All right. Hey guys, we got to do what we got to do. We're busy moms here. We got to do it when we can do it. But what
Zoom is asking me if I'm playing music, which not quite.
I know, it was doing that to me earlier. But what are your thoughts on how the church can be a healthy space? And I will also say and add to that, just in that comment, is that if you don't feel that your church is that healthy space, like, you can leave, you can go somewhere else. And I think that's something that people don't realize sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point that there are so many places, so many churches that are already healthy is a really good corrective, because of course those are, nobody's writing a news story about those churches. There's nothing to report there, right? Like, it's just normal stuff. And so it is often like the worst case scenarios that we hear about, especially like from afar. As far as how churches can be healthy, I always come back to this line that I heard repeatedly from pastors while I interviewed, or while I was researching this book, people I interviewed, just like in other people's reporting on social media, unprompted. And it stuck with me because it was so strange, like how almost word for word it was. And it was always to the effect of like, as a pastor, I get people an hour or two a week, but whatever it is, their like favorite media outlet, Fox or MSNBC or Facebook or Twitter, whatever their drug of choice, that's getting them for 10, 15, 20, 30 hours a week. And I can't compete with that.
I've heard that, yeah.
And I think like church as a place where we are spending time together, like that time alone is part of discipleship and part of learning to follow Jesus together. And so, you're never going to spend 20 hours a week listening to sermons, right? But you might spend 20 hours a week, like hanging out with people and having dinners and doing, some portion of that will be like formal church programming, but not the bulk of it. And so I think building up that thick community life is a really big, important thing that churches can be doing, that congregations can be doing it, and something that is not all on the pastor to do by himself, right? Like that's something that the congregation as a whole it's a shared responsibility and something that we all take part in. And inevitably, I think when you're organizing that around church life, a big portion of that will involve some degree of like more explicit theological conversation and thinking about what is true. And that isn't much like with what we were saying about conspiracy theories. Like, it's not going to be like a point for point refutation of wrong things that you saw on the news that day or whatever, or on Facebook or what have you. But it's more that exposure to truth over time, repeatedly, in that good communal context should help you to develop a feel for it, and to be able to sort of instinctively, in many cases, recognize something seems a little off here, or that does sound truthful. Much in the way that you can feel the difference between like different types of fabric. It's not something you can maybe easily articulate, but generally speaking, your feel for it becomes a pretty good guide.
Yeah, that's a really super interesting way of saying it, because I feel like I've been in this political world for so long that it's easy for me to recognize when something seems off, but that is not the case for many people. And so it's worth intentionally pursuing ways to start recognizing that, and just to acknowledge that, this is present. I think they can start by reading your book. I think that would be a good start. They'll get some good knowledge there. Well, Bonnie, thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really appreciate your perspective. I can't wait to finish your book. If people want to get in touch with you or buy the book, can you tell them how they can do that?
Yeah, so the book should be available anywhere books are sold. If you do buy it directly from my publisher, it would be, I think it's like bakerbookhouse.com. If you search Baker Books, you'll find it. It's frequently like at a discount and with free shipping, and there's an advantage of not having so many like supply chain things. Apparently, people are having trouble getting books from Amazon promptly sometimes. So that's a good option, specifically. And then as far as finding me, I do have a Substack, which has mostly been about like the book and related themes so far, and that's bonniekristian.substack.com. And I'm also on Twitter